Last week, Twitter was hacked, and it was a pretty big one. High-profile Twitter accounts like Bill Gates, Elon Musk, President Obama, Joe Biden, Kanye West, all taken over, tweeting out a cryptocurrency scam. How did this happen? In this video, we're gonna break that down. I also brought in Marcus Hutchins, a famous hacker known for stopping the WannaCry ransomware, and I got his take on this Twitter hack.
So you can tweet from any account on the entire platform. You could do anything. You could crash the stock market, you could start a war, you could swing the election, you could really do anything, and that's what scares me.
You need to learn hacking. In this Twitter hack, hackers somehow gained access to internal Twitter admin tools that gave them complete access to high-profile Twitter accounts.
I followed some leads. The issue is I found someone who had access to the Twitter backend systems. Well, not the backend, their admin panel. And I have proof that they used that to hack accounts.
They were able to bypass all security controls, so things like strong passwords and two-factor authentication. They could just disable those features, take over the account, make it their own, and start tweeting like it's theirs. The scariest part about this is how they did it, because they did not use traditional technical skills like you might think. They didn't hack into the network bypassing firewalls. They didn't find bugs in Twitter code and exploit vulnerabilities. No, you see, they didn't hack Twitter's systems. They hacked Twitter's people. Hacking people is a thing. Every company's greatest security weakness. The biggest risk is their people, is you. Hacking people, this technique, this process, is called social engineering.
We are going to try to manipulate them. We're going to use guile. We're going to use deception. We're going to use just about any means necessary in which to get the user to either give me access to something or give me information that they should.
Basically, it's the art of tricking people. And that's kind of amazing. Oh, and by the way, that video clip I just played, that's IT Pro TV, and they're sponsoring this part of my journey. So a huge shout out and thank you. If you want to check them out, because they are my primary learning source for hacking, I've got a link below, or code network Chuck, you'll get 30% off forever. And it's awesome. Now, Twitter was hacked because someone got tricked. But how? You see, social engineering comes in many forms. And I like to divide it into two categories. One is the human interaction and one is the computer interaction. The human being interacting with people, preying on social situations.
All you have to do is be confident and be willing to go in and do and pretend you're basically a good actor. Being able to bluff your way through, have the confidence and the bravado necessary to make someone believe you.
Let's say I walk up to your office building. I see a guy walk up to the door, use his badge, open the door, and I say, hey, buddy, can you hold the door open for me? I got a big box. Can you hold the door for me? He opens it for me. I go in. That's called tailgating. I'm walking down the hall. I look on the wall and I see a plaque that says Bob Vance, CTO. I see a lady at her desk with a name tag Vanessa. I walk over and say, hey, Vanessa, I was just talking with Bob Vance. I'm the new help desk guy. I need to look at your computer. Can you please write down your username and password? I need to do a few tests. Think about that situation. Could it happen to your company? And it could also be computer-based. It might be an email, a phishing message.
But then there's other ways of doing it, which is through electronic means. Maybe I'm going to go through the computer or their mobile device, and I'm going to interact with the user through that medium.
I might drop a 128 gig USB flash drive in the parking lot. It has malicious software on it, but George can't help himself. That's 128 gigs. That's amazing. He goes to his work computer, plugs it in. I'm in. So how did this go down? How did these hackers use social engineering to hack into Twitter? Well, right now we essentially have two stories. One from the New York Times and one from Vice. And what's really funny is both of these stories claim to have the actual hackers, the hackers responsible for the hack, as their sources. And it only happened last week. A little weird.
They managed to get an interview with one of the hackers, someone who was involved, and they were like, yeah, this guy named Kirk gave us the access. But if they're doing interviews with the media, the chances are they're not hiding very well.
No, because if I had done that, you wouldn't ever see me again. Because that's
exactly.
That is so stupid. Why would they? Now, real quick, let's take a look at the official Twitter response and their update regarding what happened. And I will say this does sort of corroborate both Vice and the New York Times stories. So Twitter said this: at this time, we believe attackers targeted certain Twitter employees through a social engineering scheme. The attackers successfully manipulated a small number of employees and used their credentials to access Twitter's internal systems. And this is insane. They targeted 130 Twitter accounts. They were actually able to take over and send tweets from 45 accounts. And these are like legit important blue check mark accounts. People we know, love, and trust. Well, kind of. And we know they somehow got access to internal tools that only Twitter employees have. Okay, so we know they use social engineering to manipulate these Twitter employees. But how did they do this?
So I feel like the term social engineering was kind of put to have people read between the lines. And a lot of what I'm hearing is it wasn't like they tricked this admin into giving them access. They say they just straight up bribed them.
Now, Twitter hasn't told us more on this, but Vice and the New York Times apparently talked to the hackers behind this. Now, we will go into more detail on who are these hackers, where they come from. But first, I want to analyze the social engineering techniques they maybe used to hack into Twitter. Now, according to the New York Times, there's a guy named Kirk. Now, that's what we're told his name is. We don't know if that's actually his real name. Probably not. Kirk. Not really a hacker name, is it? I don't know. Doesn't really strike fear into the hearts of companies. Kirk was apparently bragging on a Discord server that he was a Twitter employee and he had access to take over all these high-profile Twitter accounts. Now, these two hackers named LOL, or LOL, and Ever So Anxious, they saw Kirk bragging and he was posting photos of this Twitter admin panel that was pretty much proving that he had access to these high-profile social media accounts. But they learned soon after that he wasn't actually a Twitter employee, but he did use Twitter employees to gain access to this panel. Another source, a hacker that calls himself Plug Walk Joe, he heard that this Kirk guy somehow got access to the internal Twitter Slack channel and was able to see both the credentials and the method in which he could access these Twitter admin panels. So according to this story, Kirk used Slack to gain access to the Twitter admin panel. But how did he get access to Slack? Did he use social engineering and trick some Twitter employees? Did he use any kind of hacking method to access Slack? We don't know. And then once he had access to these Slack channels, apparently the Twitter employees are posting their credentials in plain text right there. If they're actually doing that, Twitter, please train your employees. That's really bad. Now here in a moment, we'll go into more on where do these hackers come in and where does Plug Walk Joe come in? What do they have to do with it? We'll cover that. But let's jump to the Vice story real quick. Vice's sources said they used a rep that literally did all the work for them. And by rep, I assume that means an internal Twitter employee with the appropriate access. A second source said that they actually paid the Twitter insider. So this story is a bit simpler.
They found a Twitter employee and we're like, hey, we'll pay you this much for access. And the employee was like, here, have my account. That's obviously not being confirmed by Twitter. It's a rumor that I have seen come from not only major news outlets, but also one of the people who was involved in the hacking of Twitter accounts using this admin panel. They attested to the fact that they just bribed a Twitter admin.
It sounds like we had more than one hacker involved in this that was using social engineering to manipulate these Twitter employees. One of these hackers could have been Kirk, and they simply paid a Twitter employee to gain access. And one source saying that the Twitter employee did everything, gave them everything they needed. And this does match up to a social engineering attack. There are 5 basic reasons that a social engineering attack is so effective. One is that they feed on human nature. And for a lot of people, that means they just default trust people. 2 is ignorance, and this is prevalent because not everyone understands social engineering attacks, or they may not see the signs that they are being attacked. 3 is fear. The hacker may make this employee feel like if they don't give them this information, they may get in trouble. Remember, this hacker could be impersonating somebody important. They could be acting like a manager, maybe a cop. Could be anything, and they would use fear as a tactic. Number 4 is where I think this Twitter attack really comes in. That's greed. We don't know much about this Twitter employee, or maybe even employees, but we did hear from one source that they were paid, and greed is a powerful, powerful force. This could be a disgruntled employee that maybe got overlooked for a few raises, maybe that promotion, and they're not happy about the compensation. And they're thinking, I deserve more money. And all of a sudden this guy comes in and says, hey, if you give me access to your Twitter admin panel, I'll give you some serious cash. Or maybe it even wasn't serious cash. Maybe it was $50 to $100. And then finally, number 5 would be moral obligation. The hacker could trick them to feeling like they are morally obligated to do this, to give them information or allow them in. Now, according to the EC Council, there are 4 stages involved in a social engineering attack. Stage 1, research. 2, select a victim. 3, develop a relationship. And 4, exploit the relationship. Now, this is for a traditional social engineering attack. I don't think that this attack involved all these steps because these hackers don't sound like they are legit hackers. This Kirk guy, I think, may have just fallen into this information. So I don't believe he may have researched and looked for a victim. So I don't think he actually went through the process of selecting a victim or even developing a relationship. I think this Kirk guy and these hackers maybe just had some friends or buddies or acquaintances who they knew were Twitter employees. They heard they had access and they just exploited their already existing relationship. Now, what reason do I have to think that Kirk and these hackers aren't legit hackers?
Personally, I think just based on what I found, assuming the access that I verified had happened is also the access used for the Bitcoin scam, then it's most likely someone who is not well connected in the hacking scene. They don't know how much this access is worth, or if they do, how to sell it, and they just thought, hey, what is the fastest way to make untraceable money using celebrities' Twitter accounts? And they came up with, let's do a Bitcoin scam.
At first glance, it appears they made some good money, over $180,000 through this Bitcoin scam. But then sit back and think about this for a second. They had what many hackers dream about. They had admin access to some crazy high-profile Twitter accounts. Bill Gates, Elon Musk, former President Obama, Joe Biden, these are some serious people. In a way, he kidnapped these people and he can make them say whatever he wanted them to say. Just that alone is super valuable information. So I think that Kirk and these other hackers either didn't know how valuable this information was or just didn't have a way to sell it because they weren't embedded into the hacking community. They just didn't know.
Yeah, and it's most likely this wasn't a planned attack. It sounds a lot like they just came across access one day and they're like, okay, quick, what do we do with this? It wasn't something that they had meticulously planned out for years and years, in which case they might have found a better way to make some more money or found some contacts to sell the access to. It really does sound like someone just gave them access and they were like, okay, let's run riot with this.
I mean, can you imagine what other countries may have paid for this access, like Russia and all these people, to have access to our political leaders and former political leaders' Twitter accounts? That's crazy.
Well, I think it feeds back into what you just said, is I see all these hacks where people get incredible access and then they do dumb stuff. And I think, what if this person didn't do the dumb thing? You've got access to every Twitter account ever, except for maybe the president. It's not this hack, but it's that someone achieves the same level of access and does something really bad with it.
Now let's think about this for a second. From what we know about the attack right now, it wasn't very sophisticated. It wasn't some massive criminal enterprise full of extremely skilled hackers trying to hack into a network and find vulnerabilities. No, it was simple social engineering, and I'm telling you, this is one of the most dangerous threats we have facing us. All of these big companies, and even smaller and medium-sized companies, invest millions of dollars in their security infrastructure. But there will always be that huge gaping hole. Their employees, their people. I mean, think about this. That Twitter admin panel that gave these hackers godlike access to all these Twitter accounts. That type of tool is not unique to Twitter. I'm sure Facebook, LinkedIn, Netflix, Amazon, Microsoft Azure, all these companies have some form of administrator panel or portal where their employees can manage things. And while they may have hundreds of security controls to protect that admin portal, from VPN to secure passwords and all kinds of stuff, it really comes down to that employee. What if one day they're just fed up? I'm done. And they can give access to anybody. And also think about this. This Twitter attack, this hack, affected all of us. Because I could have been hacked. You could have been hacked. We just weren't one of the ones chosen. We weren't important enough to be hacked. But we could have been. I have a strong password. I have two-factor authentication. Didn't matter in this case.
I think people will start to consider social media less as something they own that is in their house, and more of essentially like a public park. You can go to a public park and you can do things, but there is no belief that anything you do there is going to be seen by you and only you. And I think people will start seeing social media as the same way and realizing that while direct messages imply that only you and the recipient get that message, those messages are stored in Twitter's system. So anyone who has access to Twitter's internal systems could theoretically have access to your direct messages. And I think, and I hope, people will reconsider what they put online, even if this is in a private message, because there is always the risk your account gets hacked, your messages get leaked.
So does that change how you view your online accounts. You're obeying all the rules, but you know what? Hackers don't obey the rules. They can come in, they can use social engineering to become a Twitter employee and have that admin level access to your stuff. Now let's talk more about where these guys come in, these hackers and Plugwalk Joe. I said I'd come back to this and talk about it, so let's do it now. From what we've heard so far, I think this Kirk guy took things a little too far, further than these two hackers down here wanted to go. You see, initially it was all about obtaining OG accounts.
The person I was following who had access to this admin panel was a member of a community that's referred to as the OG username community, and these are people who find ways to steal social media accounts with unique usernames.
For example, like on Twitter, it might be @ A or @ B. Those single character usernames that are crazy valuable if you think about it. And this website here, which is ogusers.com, is basically a marketplace where they buy and sell these Twitter accounts. So the original idea is that Kirk had access to this Twitter admin panel, which gave him the ability to access and take over all these OG accounts. So Kirk told LOL and Ever So Anxious, hey, I want to sell these accounts. Can you be the middleman? You have the connections, you know the people. Can we work together to sell these @ A or @ B or @ 6? And that's where Plugwalk Joe comes in. See, Plugwalk Joe bought the Twitter username @ 6. And apparently that was his only involvement with this. He didn't steal anything, he just purchased the Twitter account @ 6, which Kirk had stolen using the Twitter admin panel. And this is all that they were doing, until Kirk went a little bit crazy. Kirk and whoever else it was started their Bitcoin scam and started posting on these high-profile Twitter accounts. Now, obviously, that's going to raise some red flags with the world, because it's a very scary thing they're doing. I don't believe LOL or Ever So Anxious had any intention of doing that, which is why I think is the reason they were the sources. They were talking to the New York Times and Plugwalk Joe doing the same thing. They were like, hey, we're just buying and selling Twitter accounts. We had nothing to do with what this Kirk guy just did. Now, side note, and this is actually pretty interesting, Plugwalk Joe and these other hackers like LOL and Ever So Anxious, their normal method, or maybe the more traditional method for stealing Twitter accounts, is a thing called SIM hijacking, often referred to as SIM swapping. And it's really a genius social engineering attack. And really, no one's actually safe from it if you're using your phone as a two-factor authentication method. So you know your cell phone has a SIM card inside, and this is what's tied to your cell phone number. What these hackers will do is they'll call up your cell phone provider, let's say in this case, AT&T. And what they'll do is they'll try to impersonate you, or maybe your spouse. And they'll try to trick this person using social engineering techniques to activate another SIM card that's in a cell phone they have, and move your number to their phone. And they essentially have your cell phone now, which means in a lot of cases they have control of all your accounts, bank accounts, social media accounts. Fun fact, even Jack Dorsey, the founder of Twitter back in 2017, had his Twitter account taken over with this method. Even the founder of Twitter isn't safe. So you can imagine they were really excited when they found out that they had a contact at Twitter who had access to the admin panel, and they could just take over whatever social media account they wanted without having to go through the process of calling up the cell phone provider and getting the SIM swapped and then doing a password reset and all that kind of stuff. No, it's much easier just controlling the platform. One of the biggest social media platforms in the world was brought to its knees by a social engineering attack that only involved a few people. From what we can tell, these weren't professionals or super experienced hackers. And this just goes to show that really no company is safe.
I think the issue is we're relying too much on brands to protect us. Like, Security Company Limited sells us this magic box that they say stops 99.9% of hackers. And the company will buy their magic box and they will put it on their network. And then they will do nothing else to secure their system. And often these hackers they're not bypassing these like amazing super secure firewalls. They're getting in with the most basic techniques. They're convincing the admin to type his password into a web form, or they're sending a link to a PDF that's full of malware. I think the issue is less that the attacks are so sophisticated they can't be stopped, and it's more that the majority attacks just people don't think far enough ahead to have any chance of stopping them.
How do you protect your company from your people, from your employees? One of the best things we can do now is just employee training, teaching your employees about social engineering attacks. And yes, there are other things you can do, like isolating roles in a company and then implementing least privilege in every area you can. But it always comes down to an individual person and making sure they know enough to protect themselves and the company.
It's always the user. You have very occasional things like WannaCry, where it uses computer vulnerabilities to just hop inside a network unassisted. But 99.99999% of malware is through some kind of user interaction. That's whether they clicked a link in an email, they downloaded a file, they installed a questionable app or a game from a torrent. It is almost always the user that lets them into the network.
All right, quiz question time, brought to you by my sponsor, IT Pro TV. Let's go up to the top here and click on Practice Test. And here's our question. A customer receives an unsolicited call from a known software company. The person on the other end requires the customer to verify their user credentials over the phone. Which term describes this type of hacking? Put your answer in the comments below. Again, massive shout out to IT Pro TV for sponsoring this part of my hacking journey. I wanted to show you this real quick. I can actually go and use a social engineering lab through them, which is actually amazing. They walk you through a few social engineering attacks, and one of the ones they do is a fake website and you capture login credentials. It's pretty cool. Check this out. I launched a fake Twitter, and when I go here and I try to log in, test, click sign in. If I look back at the command prompt, bam, it captured the username and password. Just one of the many social engineering attacks you can use. And also a huge shout out to Malware Tech or Marcus Hutchins for coming on the channel to talk about the Twitter hack. Go follow his YouTube channel. He's got a YouTube channel where he does stuff like this. It's pretty cool. And go follow him on Twitter. Guys, that's all I got. Let me know below what you think. What do you think happened with Twitter? Do you have a different theory or idea? Let me know below. Well, that's all I got. I'll catch you guys next time.